This image comes from the Dondale Juvenile Detention Centre in Darwin, that was then broadcast by the ABC Four Corners program that aired on Monday, July 25th. That program prompted a knee-jerk reaction from the Australian government to launch a royal commission into the child protection and youth detention systems of the Northern Territory. Now, this image in particular evoked shock and horror amongst the media and political elites, particularly, of course, by those on the left, producing headlines like this and comparisons to Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, and to the inevitable knee-jerk responses like this. But might I suggest some context here? Context that the ABC did not provide. For example, here's how the ABC led the story.
Welcome to Four Corners. The image you've just seen isn't from Guantanamo Bay or Abu Ghraib, but Australia in 2015. A boy, hooded, shackled, strapped to a chair, and left alone. It is barbaric. This is juvenile justice in the Northern Territory, a system that punishes troubled children instead of rehabilitating them.
Sounds grim, but what you can't see in that clip was the events leading up to 17-year-old Dylan Voller being restrained. From the transcript of the event, you can clearly see that he was acting out and threatening to self-harm, and he was known to often spit on the prison guards, hence the mesh hood to stop exactly that. Also, Voller has been in and out of detention centres since he was 11 years old. He had committed more than 50 offences, many of them violent. He'd gotten on ice, tried to run down a policeman, joined in a pack assault that left the victim unconscious, and attacked his own mother. So the idea that this is just a harmless boy being tortured is at best misleading, and at worst, a wild exaggeration of the facts. John Heffernan, former governor of Grafton Jail, with more than 33 years working in both adult and juvenile corrections, had this to say about the torture story. In regard to the recent exposure of the so-called torture of young offenders in the Northern Territory Juvenile Detention Centres, I don't think I've ever seen such an unprecedented overreaction during all my years working in the criminal justice system. As evidence of this torture, the ABC presented an image of a detainee in a chair with a hood over his head and proclaimed this the way prisoners of war are treated, not kids. I'm sorry, but through my experienced eyes, I see a juvenile offender who has obviously been acting out, being provided time out, restrained in an approved chair with an approved spit hood covering his head. But the opinion of a corrections expert is drowned out by the now too predictable professional grievance mongers that love to virtue signal and play on emotions. Now, is there evidence of mistreatment of children in detention in the Northern Territory? Yes, there were signs of excessive force used against some children, a tear-gassing incident, and the questionable use of solitary confinement for days on end. But the Northern Territory government hasn't just turned a blind eye. The Dondale Detention Centre has been closed down, and a comprehensive 65-page report was produced in January last year detailing the problems in the state's youth detention system. So what will this Royal Commission achieve, except for the obvious short-term political point scoring of appearing to be doing something? Well, let's have a look at its remit. As you can see from this list, all the things you expect a commission to address about the youth detention system, as well as recommendations for reform. But is there anything else that may be of relevance? Well, perhaps we can get a clue from the aforementioned report into the exact same detention system that this Royal Commission is aimed at. Quote, "The Northern Territory youth detainee population has risen steadily, particularly over the last 2 years. This has placed pressure on the available infrastructure and capacity of its detention facilities. Remanded detainees account for the majority of the detainee population, which sees an overrepresentation rate for Indigenous youth, who make up approximately 97% of that detainee population. Higher detainee numbers, inability to separate detainees appropriately, including female detainees, and what they see as a different type of high-risk, aggressive detainee with challenging behaviours are some of the major factors that have resulted in unrest within the youth system, which in turn has placed pressure on staffing, room accommodation, and other centre infrastructure. How much of an increase? According to the report, more than 100% in 6 years. So unfortunately, it appears that the Royal Commission will not be addressing the causes of significantly increased detainee numbers, which, if you believe in prevention is better than cure, is undoubtedly more important. And what other reason do we have to suppose that this is little more than a political exercise? Well, how about the appointment of the Honourable Brian Ross Martin QC to head the commission, who rose to prominence, quote, when he sent a 55-year-old man to jail for just 1 month for carnal knowledge and aggravated assault against a 14-year-old girl. The senior elder from Yarralin had held the girl against her will for 4 days, beaten her with a boomerang, and forced her to undergo anal intercourse. But in his defence, he argued the girl had been promised to him in marriage, and he believed his actions were permitted under traditional law. The Chief Justice Brian Martin had no choice but to convict the man, but expressed sympathy for him and sentenced him to 2 years jail, suspended after 1 month. That sentence was subsequently overturned on appeal and increased to 17 months in jail, and there were calls by lawmakers to review customary laws in the Aboriginal community, and rightfully so. So the Honourable Mr. Martin has a questionable track record with respect to Indigenous issues, and makes his appointment a bit of a head-turner, given that the youth detention system problem in the Northern Territory is primarily an Indigenous community problem. And in my next video, I'll be attempting to put some numbers and context around the extent of Indigenous crime and youth detention in the Northern Territory.